Okay, so for the final part of this lesson on civilizations as a unit of historical analysis, we're going to consider the issue of interaction between civilizations. So are civilizations really self-contained historical units? That was a hard part of Spengler's theory. He said that, each civilization is a law unto itself. It comes into existence, it goes through a life cycle, and then it comes to an end and either disappears or continues in this stagnant state. But it's a thing in its own right. And it's also part of Toynbee's theory when he talks about civilizations as the smallest intelligible unit of historical analysis. So saying that if we're thinking about the history of England, so long as we consider the rest of Europe, European civilization, then we're going to cover everything that was important, every important influence on English history. So with this European civilization, we've captured everything that is relevant to the history of England or of any other nation within this European civilization. But we don't need to consider anything outside it. That wasn't part of the civilization. It wasn't part of this historical unit. Well, the French historian René Grousset, who has been described as the French Toynbee, so he was also interested in civilizations, though his work wasn't as systematic or as voluminous as Toynbee's. But he said that if you go through Toynbee's work, in fact, he's often talking about interaction between one civilization and another. And this interaction is affecting the evolution of those civilizations in his own descriptions of how this civilization has developed. So in fact, he denies his own idea that we only need to consider the civilization as the unit in order to understand its internal history. And one of his important points was he said that if you look at these barbarians that in these theories come and invade the civilization, so Toynbee called them the external proletariat, for example, they were part of his theory. He says they were often coming, although they're always coming out of Central Asia, or we could say Central Eurasia. These barbarian peoples, or whatever we like to call them. So, for example, they invaded Western civilization, the Huns, invaded the West, Attila the Hun, AD 451. But they were also invading China. Whether we call them the Xiongnu or sometimes the Northern Barbarians. And they were a perennial issue in Chinese history, but say from about 200 BC into the early centuries AD, they were coming into China and affecting Chinese history. And they were also coming out and invading India, the so-called Hephthalite peoples. And this is about AD 500. So Grousset's point is that if you look narrowly, yes, you can see these external peoples, these invaders come and invade each civilization. But if you divide it up into civilizations, you're going to miss the fact that there was this bigger picture, that there were these peoples in Central Eurasia who, for whatever reason, were coming out outwards in these pulses, these great waves, and affecting the civilizations around the periphery. So this is not a single civilizational process. It's a worldwide process, or at least a continent-wide, a Eurasia-wide process of these pulses of outward movement from Central Eurasia. And we need to understand that overall dynamic. We can't just divide it up into these narrow perspectives of just looking at each civilization individually, because that way we will miss this big picture. So more recently, the civilization theorist, or more described himself as a world system theorist, I suppose civilization theorists these days would call themselves theorists about world systems, has suggested that we need to think in terms of degrees of interaction rather than an either or, that, you know, a civilization is completely self-contained and there's a hard boundary around it. There's in fact, there can be connections across civilizations, but it's a matter of how strong those connections are. So they suggest there are several degrees of connection. Firstly, there's the area over which bulk goods are exchanged. So he calls this the bulk goods network. So we're talking bulk goods, things like grain and pottery and stone for building, heavy, bulky goods that are difficult to transport. You know, in the Middle Ages, these could not be moved over long distances. So the exchanges within which, or the areas within which exchange of those bulk goods took place was fairly narrow. So typically, you know, within what would today be a modern country. So you had, you know, various bulk goods networks, and but then those bulk good networks could interact with each other in what he calls the political military network. So, for example, you know, stone and wheat exchange might have been largely within England and within France, but there were political and military connections between England and France. So they fought wars with each other. They exchanged in dynastic marriages. You know, they married into each other's families. They had diplomatic relationships and so on. So there's a wider network of political military interaction. You may only transport your wheat over, you know, 50 miles, but to go and fight wars, you can go 200, 500 miles. And then, so then we've got various political military networks. And according to Chase-Dunn, then these can all be contained within a prestige goods network. Prestige goods as opposed to bulk goods. So we're talking precious metals, silk, things that are expensive and small, so that they can be exchanged over much greater distances, like on the silk routes, for example. And we can see then that the political military network kind of corresponds to what Toynbee would call a civilization. That's his intelligible unit of analysis. It's where the sort of everyday history of wars and diplomatic interaction takes place. But there can be exchanges of goods with other political military networks. You know, the Chinese political military network. But these are just of prestige goods. And then beyond that, Chase-Dunn suggests there is an information network. So because these political military networks are in communication with each other, that means that ideas can move between them and affect, you know, technological evolution, for example, or institutional change within each political military network. So, and he suggests that, though, that the information network is not exactly the same as the prestige good network, because civilizations can be kind of resistant to ideas coming from outside. So they may or may not accept those ideas. That they might be accepting the other civilizations' gold or silk scarves, but they're not necessarily affecting their ideas about the world, their religion, and so on. So he draws his information network sort of overlapping the prestige goods network, but not entirely coincident with it. Sometimes it does include those other political military networks, and sometimes it doesn't if they're resistant to it. That's the information network. So we have to think in terms of these degrees of connection. And we can also imagine, you know, that these aren't hard and fast, but they seem to provide a good set of layers: the bulk goods, political military interaction, prestige goods, and then information and ideas. And given these ideas of different networks, then Chase-Dunn considers the evolution of these networks over time, so that as technology improved, transport and communications technology improved, these networks were able to expand. So over here we have the West, and we start off around 4000 BC with the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian political military networks, shown here in black. And they were separate from each other at this time. They formed separate political military networks. And they became joined, their prestige goods networks, which is shown in red surrounding it, which extended over a wider area. Their prestige good networks were originally also not connected, but they became connected after a while, even though the political military networks were still not connected. But as time went on, and as I say, transport improved, the Egyptian and Mesopotamian political military networks connected. They started to interact with each other politically and militarily, fighting wars against each other, exchanging diplomats. And then this interaction of between the different parts of Western civilizations kind of went in pulses. You know, sometimes empires expanded and knitted it together, and then they contracted. So there was expansion and contraction of the political military network. And we've got a similar thing over here in the East. So we've got, say, the India and China, for example, here in the East. And their political military networks started off separate, but then became connected. And then here, there was a time when the Western and the Eastern political military networks were connected briefly under the Mongol Empire. So that temporarily connected them, and then when the Mongol Empire collapsed, they became separate again. That similar thing with the prestige goods, that at a time of expansion both in the East and West, they became joined, and then there was contraction, and the prestige goods trade fell apart, and so they became disconnected again, and then they became connected, and then again disconnected temporarily. But as time has gone on, they've become larger, and the connections have become longer lasting until they're now permanent. And so in the last few centuries, the Eastern and Western political military networks have become completely combined into one. So we can see this idea of, through time, these the civilization units, or what we consider the intelligible unit of analysis, grows in size as people can become better connected through improving technologies. And then the theoretical historian David Wilkinson has taken these ideas forward with the concept of a central civilization that has grown by absorbing all the other civilizations. So we start off here, we're here around about 3000, 4000 BC down to today. So we've got the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian civilizations, which became joined, and this was the beginning of the Central Civilization. And then the Aegean civilization, the Minoan civilization of Crete, that is, eventually became absorbed into that. Again, all this is made possible by improving transport and communications, the sail, allowing navigation across the Mediterranean. And so this was now the Central Civilization. Then what he calls the Irish civilizations. So the peoples of far Western Europe become absorbed into this Central Civilization. And we've got similar things going on in the East. So the Far Eastern Civilization, Indochina, Indic Civilization, Japan, they sort of start to become joined here. And then they're absorbed into the Central Civilization in recent times. Also African civilizations, West Africa, West Central Africa, East African civilizations eventually join the Central Civilization. And then the Mississippian civilization is a bit of an anomaly, the Mississippian civilization of North America, because it disappeared shortly before Columbus arrived, or at least around the same time that Columbus arrived. So it never got a chance to be absorbed into the Central Civilization. It ceased to exist before it made contact with it. And then we've got the Mexican civilization, the Peruvian civilization, the Incas, and the Chibchan civilization of South America, modern day sort of Colombia. So all of these have become now joined, and we just have one world civilization, one single central civilization. That's Wilkinson's theory. And you can find maps if you Google AROS, that's the Institute for Research on World Systems, and Wilkinson's maps. If you Google something like that, you'll find Wilkinson's maps showing the evolution through time of these different civilizations, the areas that they covered.